Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the DACA decision virtual briefing hosted by the Dreamer Resource Center at Sacramento State in partnership with the Northern California and DocuCenters Collaborative. My name is Eric Ramirez, and I'm the coordinator of the Dreamer Resource Center at Sac State. Thank you for joining us this afternoon to learn more about the Supreme Court's recent decision on Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA. Today, we will hear from an immigration attorney who will explain what the ruling means. And then during a Q&A section, you will have an opportunity to ask questions and obtain clarification based on the presentation or what other questions you might still have. The Q&A will be handled through the Q&A feature. We have disabled the chat box for today. And I will tell you more about the structure of today's webinar and go over the logistics in just a little bit. But first, I would like to introduce someone whose commitment to undocumented students and students from underrepresented backgrounds makes the Dreamer Resource Center and several other programs at Sac State a success. Associate Vice President of Strategic Student Support Programs, Dr. Viridiana Diaz.
Thank you, Eric. And as Eric mentioned, I serve as Associate Vice President of Strategic Student Support Programs at Sacramento State. Welcome. In this role, I have the great honor to oversee a handful of equity programs that include the Dreamer Resource Center. I also would like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for today's briefing. As we all know, last week the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against the Trump administration and prevented the termination of DACA. While we are still celebrating this wonderful news, many questions remain, and we also know that the fight is far from over. Today's briefing will help us understand what the DACA decision means and what comes next, and it will address questions that are top of mind for our students and their families. We recognize that these are unprecedented times and that the coronavirus pandemic has added additional layers of concern to our immigrant and undocumented communities. Therefore, we must keep ourselves informed on the issues that impact the students and communities we serve, and also ensure that we disseminate accurate information. Joining today's virtual briefing are students, faculty, staff, administrators, and allies from Sacramento State and from Dream Centers in the Sacramento area and throughout Northern California. This collaboration is a testament to the support that exists for students and families impacted by undocumented status here at Sacramento State and also in our region. At Sacramento State, undocumented students are welcome with open arms, and our institution is proud to be a home for dreamers. This level of support is reinforced daily by higher leadership, particularly by our president, Dr. Robert L. Nelson. President Nelson cares deeply about the well-being and the success of all students, including students impacted by undocumented status, and his actions speak louder than words. Here to say a few welcome remarks is President Robert L. Nelson.
Welcome, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here today. I didn't think we were going to be here on this note. I thought this was going to be a somber, sad day, but we ended up in so much better place than we ever dreamed we were going to end up, thanks to the ruling by the Supreme Court. Now, as Viridiana and Eric have said, we have to be very vigilant and make sure that we're moving forward and that we still are there for our students, because they need us as much now as they ever will. And so I ask all of us to get involved, listen to the advice that's here, help our students feel secure, especially in this time with COVID, and help them to see their futures brightly in front of them. It's important that they go to school. It's important that they renew their DACA papers. It's important that they have the life that they so fully deserve. And so thank you to the partners, to all of the pro bono lawyers that have stepped up, to the universities and colleges, to everyone who's really cares about our students. We are truly blessed today, and let's move forward. Seguimos adelante. And as always, Sac State's #1. Stingers up, baby.
Thank you, President Nelson. We appreciate your support and commitment to empowering our students and the students that we serve that are impacted by undocumented status. Again, thank you for making Sac State a home. All right, before we get started, I want to give you a quick overview of the briefing and mention a few housekeeping items. We'll start with the attorney's presentation, which will take about 25 minutes or so. And after that, we will shift to Q&A, which I will help facilitate. We'll be using the Q&A feature, and there will be plenty of time for questions. We do ask that you hold questions until the Q&A portion in case your question is answered at a different point of the presentation. And I'll tell you more about the Q&A feature and that process when we get there. Also, throughout the entire briefing, participant video will remain disabled. While it would be really nice to see everybody's faces and be in community together, we chose this style of webinar to allow for confidentiality of those who may not feel comfortable being identified. So now that we have the housekeeping items out of the way, I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Andrés Guerra. Andrés is a supervising staff attorney with the Coalition for Humane Immigrants' Rights, or CHIRLA, and he's going to tell us what the recent DACA decision means and what comes next. Thank you for joining us, Andrés.
Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Friday. President Nelson, Dr. Diaz, and Eric, thank you for inviting me. It's a privilege to participate in this event and to sort of impart some of the knowledge about what the DACA decision is, what it isn't, and what it means moving forward. And so, without further ado, I can jump right in to a presentation that I've prepared. We're going to be covering what the decision stated, what it means moving forward, and what some of the impacts and consequences might be. Okay, so today we're going to be discussing what happened at the Supreme Court and what it means for beyond that for our community and for our individuals. So just a little bit about the background of the DACA program. It was an executive order that was signed by President Obama in June of 2012. Largely, it was done as a response to the failure of Congress to pass comprehensive immigration reform. And the program that President Obama established essentially had two components to it. And the fact that there are these two components are going to be very important to understanding what the actual decision was at the Supreme Court last week. So the first component to the DACA program is protection against deportation. So deferred action, so DACA is deferred action for childhood arrivals. That's kind of a sub-program of deferred action, and deferred action has existed for many, many decades. It was really kind of brought into the forefront of being an immigration tool that individuals can use. Famously by John Lennon of the Beatles, he was granted deferred action to be able to perform in the United States, despite having I think it was like a marijuana conviction abroad. So deferred action is a tool by which somebody can apply for protection against deportation on an individual basis, or as DACA is as a program for a class of individuals who fit certain requirements. And we'll go through the DACA requirements in a bit, but at its core, any deferred action program, DACA included, is a program to protect against deportation for a certain period of time. DACA protection against deportation is done in 2-year increments that can be renewed. The other aspect to the DACA program is, largely speaking, what you can just refer to as benefits. So with any deferred action application, you can submit an application for work authorization, and that's the actual physical card that DACA recipients get. That work permit in turn allows you to get a social security number and a card. And then that in turn makes you eligible for certain programs federally, like Medicaid, done through the government, but even, private actors, a lot of banks, to give loans and mortgages, they want to see a social. So the benefits that kind of come with a deferred action grant are another component to the program. And they're very important because a lot of people are not already in danger of being deported. So the protection against deportation, while it's useful, it doesn't change their day-to-day so much as getting an actual work permit and a Social Security and all the attendant benefits that go with that. So those are kind of the two components to the program. You get protection against deportation, but you also get a lot of economic benefits that flow from any deferred action grants. So what did the Supreme Court decide? So this is the Department of Homeland Security versus Regents of the University of California, 588 US blank 2020. They'll go ahead and update where that exactly falls in the US volumes at the end of the term. It was a 5-4 decision, which, and I will say, we'll talk a little bit about this in just a moment, but I think a lot of us were pleasantly surprised. We were expecting a 5-4 decision, but we were expecting it to go the other way. But here, the majority, which was essentially the more liberal wing of the court, the 4 justices, with the Chief Justice Roberts, held that the Department of Homeland Security, their attempt to rescind DACA was illegal. And of course, the Department of Homeland Security is the federal agency in charge of immigration. They oversee all the sub-agencies like USCIS, ICE, Customs and Border Patrol. Those are all components of the Department of Homeland Security. And the Supreme Court held that there were in essence 2 reasons why the decision to get rid of DACA was illegal. So the first is that the decision to rescind DACA was arbitrary and capricious because this rescission of DACA sought to end both the deportation protection and the benefits components of DACA, even though they were relying on a separate court decision that only said the benefits part was illegal. So just a little bit of background, there was a separate program called DAPA, D-A-P-A, Deferred Action for Parents of Arrivals, which was essentially, Parents of Americans. It was essentially a program that was designed to give deferred action, the same protection and benefits, to parents of individuals who were actually born in the US. And so there was some litigation, and in 2015, a Texas court struck down the DAPA program because they said that the benefits portion of DAPA was illegal. The basic argument there that Texas and a few other states were trying to make was that because this was a federal program that had impact on the states, because they were the ones that had to issue driver's licenses and issue the Social Security and all the other physical cards, that because this federal program put a burden on the states to do these things, the benefits portion of any deferred action program was illegal. And so when the Department of Homeland Security tried to rescind DACA under this administration back in 2017, they used that case, which really only talked about benefits being illegal, to strike down, to get rid of both aspects of the program. And so essentially what the Supreme Court is saying here is that DHS was trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater. In other words, you're looking at case law that says one component is illegal, but you're throwing out both components. And so the decision to get rid of the deportation protection aspect of the program was arbitrary. The second reason that the court gave is that the Department of Homeland Security's action to rescind DACA was arbitrary and capricious because they didn't even consider the possible impact that the loss of DACA would have on not just the individuals who receive DACA, but their employers and the economy at large. So here, what the Supreme Court said is that you need to include in your analysis what the impact of losing DACA would be before you can just go ahead and move forward and get rid of it. And the fact that you didn't even bother to consider what the impacts of the loss of DACA might mean for all of us means that your decision to get rid of it was arbitrary. So the court has ruled in favor of the DACA program. They've rejected the current president's administration's attempt to terminate it. And they made it clear that the executive branch of the government needed to be held accountable for any decision that could end lives. In other words, what we really saw here was a check and balance of our system, of the court system telling the executive branch of the government, you need to be accountable for the decisions that you make. And so what this decision does is it restores the program in full. And what that means is that both initial and renewal applications should be accepted by USCIS, including the advanced parole program, which we're going to talk about next. Ever since the rescission of DACA that this administration undertook in September of 2017 happened, they've actually only been accepting renewal applications. So for about the last 2.5 years, only people that had previously had DACA could apply as a renewal, but now it's been opened up, and even individuals who have never had DACA before are eligible to apply now, assuming they meet the requirements of the program. So what does this mean for current DACA recipients? Current DACA recipients continue to be protected from deportation, and they continue to be eligible for benefits under the DACA program, which includes, among other things, work authorizations. And they can continue to apply to renew their DACA for 2 more years at a time. Up until now, we've been telling everybody if you have a year or less left on your DACA to just go ahead and renew. Because our understanding was, first of all, our assumption was that the Supreme Court was going to strike down DACA and uphold the administration's attempt to rescind it. So in our mind, what we were doing is telling people to renew now, because they would be getting an approval sometime this summer, which would be good until the summer of 2022. And if there is an election this year, and if things were to shake out and there was a change in government, whoever the next president is could be somebody who could bring DACA back. So we were telling individuals, if you had a year or less to renew right now, and this is going to be one of the key takeaways from today's presentation, right now we're still kind of waiting to see how USCIS is going to implement the Supreme Court decision. So yes, the Supreme Court decision happened, and DACA being back is the law in this country. But we still have yet to see how USCIS, which is the federal immigration agency that processes applications, we have yet to see how they're going to implement the decision. And so the point that I'm making now is that it might be the situation where if you have less than a year left, we'll tell you not to renew just yet. Because the last thing we would want is for USCIS to come out and say, okay, now we're going back to the pre-Supreme Court decision program of processing renewals when they're 3 to 5 months out versus the 12 months that we'd been telling people previously. So for current DACA recipients, continue to renew your DACA grant, and seek out legal services if you need them to figure out when's a good time to renew. Obviously, if you just renewed because you thought the Supreme Court decision was coming up, and you have about 2 years left on your current DACA, don't renew. You can continue to use it. If you're a year or less, I would suggest seeking somebody to discuss whether or not it's a good idea. And then any day now, USCIS could issue its implementation of the Supreme Court decision. So you're definitely going to want to be have your ear to the news and see what exactly they're going to do with the program moving forward. And so what does this mean for the community for individuals who don't have DACA. So individuals who have never had DACA should actually now be able to apply, assuming that they meet the requirements, which we're going to go over next. And all eligible individuals, or even if you think you might be eligible, you should consult with a legal service provider for information about applying for DACA for the first time, or even renewing their DACA or getting screened for eligibility for other immigration relief. It's been so common that individuals come in just to renew their DACA, and then they actually qualify for another process on top of that. And then also keep in mind that the process of applying for DACA for the first time is different from a renewal. So you're definitely, if you've never applied before, you're going to want to speak to an attorney or some other legal service provider to figure out exactly what the parameters are, what you need to show, and how you can go about applying. So let's talk a little bit about what the requirements are. So here it says, what are the requirements for an initial DACA? The fact is these are requirements for every DACA, but when you're doing a renewal, you don't have to actually show the evidence of all of this. You just submit the forms. So a first-time applicant is going to have to prove all of these bullet points. So you're eligible to request DACA if you were under the age of 31 as of June 15th, 2012. If you are over 15 at the time of the request, and there are a couple exceptions depending on whether you're in removal proceedings or subject to a final deportation order. But for now, usually the common rule is you have to be at least 15, you have to be at least 16 when you apply, over 15. You have to have come to the US before reaching your 16th birthday. You have had to have continuously resided in the US since June 15th, 2007, up until the present time. And I will say that this bullet point, this next to last bullet point, is probably the one where most DACA applications are won or lost, because you need to find proof that you can submit to USCIS that you've been in the US since June of 2007. Generally speaking, you're trying to find old employment or school records, medical records work as well. You also need to show that you were physically present in the United States on June 15th, 2012, and at the time of making your application. Next slide, you need to show that you did not have any lawful status on June 15th, 2012. You need to show that you are currently in school or have graduated or obtained a certificate of completion from a high school or a GED. And there are exceptions for military service people. And then finally, you need to show that you have not been convicted of a felony, a significant misdemeanor, or 3 or more other misdemeanors, and that you are otherwise a person of good moral character. Significant misdemeanor, I can go into a little more detail later, but there are certain categories of crime like burglary, drug crimes, DUIs, domestic violence. Those types of crimes, even if you just commit them once and it's a misdemeanor, it will be considered a significant misdemeanor. So if you have a felony, if you have one of those types of misdemeanors, or if you have 3 or more of any other types of misdemeanors, you will not qualify for the DACA program. And so what does this mean also for travel and advanced parole? So advanced parole was a program I mentioned a few slides back. Essentially, it's a program that allows DACA recipients to travel outside the United States and return. You generally need to fall under one of 3 categories in order to qualify for an advanced parole. There's humanitarian reasons, which is most commonly a sick or very sick family member in another country, or to attend a funeral. The second and third categories are related. So there's education purposes and work purposes. And so the idea is that either a school or an employer wants to send you to another country to train or to immerse yourself to get to know the language or some sort of technical skill. There's some kind of training or education component that's required if you're applying for advanced parole under one of those 2 reasons. Now, another thing to keep in mind with advanced parole is that COVID-19 is going to probably be a strain on this. There are travel restrictions in place. So on April 22nd of this year, the president issued an executive order, and then this past week, he actually renewed it. Now, it applies to a different category of individuals, but the fact is that advanced parole is a discretionary grant, which means that even if somebody can show to immigration services that they have a good reason for advanced parole, USCIS can still deny. And I think that COVID-19 is probably something that they're going to be using as a reason to deny people. They don't want to have a lot of travel inside and outside of the country. The pandemic, as it says here, is very alive and real. Anybody who's been following the news or has been following the numbers knows that the pandemic is not going away, especially in California and a handful of other states. So even though advanced parole is legally not struck down by the Supreme Court's decision, it's still a discretionary measure that immigration services may or may not grant. And then, as always, you should just consult with an attorney before you even think about leaving the country. There can be all sorts of consequences that are triggered by leaving the United States if you've already been here for a certain amount of time. And the process of applying for advanced parole is a very legal process, and you need somebody to analyze your case before you consider traveling. So, kind of big picture, thinking about whether this decision was surprising. So I think most of us were expecting the decision to go the other way. And in that sense, it is a surprising decision. Chief Justice Roberts not only joined the four more liberal judges, but he personally wrote the opinion. And when you keep in mind that there are dozens of opinions that are issued every Supreme Court term, and this DACA decision was only the third one that the Chief Justice wrote, it's pretty significant. And I think he was trying to send a message first and foremost, because he is the Chief Justice. This is known as the Roberts Court. That's just the legal parlance that you attach to every court. You describe it in terms of the Chief Justice at the time. And so it really is his legacy, I think, that is at stake. There were a lot of messages, highly inappropriate messages from the administration to the Supreme Court, and they continue to this day about a wide range of cases. But in this case in particular, there was a lot of messaging that was put out into the public from this administration targeting the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has to be independent. I don't think, I think we'd be kidding ourselves right now if we didn't acknowledge that there are 5 conservative judges on the Supreme Court and 4 liberal ones. And, that there was a lot of politics that got into play with Merrick Garland's nomination. But the fact is, the Supreme Court has to be independent under the Constitution. And so I think Roberts acknowledges that he needed to put some distance in between himself and the current president in order to maintain his own legacy and that of the court. Another reason why it might not be all that surprising is that last year in the 2019 term, the same Justice Roberts joined the same 4 justices to defeat the census citizenship question. And that was another one that was also largely political, and where the administration was sending a lot of messages to the Supreme Court about how they wanted the decision to come out. And so the fact that Roberts did this last year, kind of lends credence to the fact that he does understand or maybe adopts a different position with respect to immigration, or that at the very least, he just wants to distance himself from the immigration policies of this administration. And then the last thing to keep in mind is that court decisions are always influenced and shaped by social movements, as much as they say that their decisions in chambers are only based on the law and what is in front of them. I have to think that a lot of court decisions are actually influenced by social movements. One perfect example is Brown versus Board of Education. That was actually a 1954 decision about segregation in public schools. And for the longest time, that decision was actually going to be 8-1 until the Supreme Court Chief Justice told every other justice that they had to vote against segregation because historically he wanted it to be a unanimous court that came out in favor of civil rights. So Brown versus Board is a perfect example. There was also Obergefell, which came out in 2013, which was the Supreme Court decision about same-sex marriage. And that was another one where, you know, I have to think that if Obergefell had been decided 20 or 30 years prior, it might have been a 7-2 or 8-1 decision against same-sex marriage. But because the social movements surrounding LGBT rights had advanced so much by 2013, I think that had a large role to play in influencing the court decision. So you know, we live obviously in a very special time right now, and there are aspects to this decision that were certainly shocking to all of us in a good way last week when it came down. But I think if you kind of break it down and sort of look at some of the behind the scenes circumstances that are at play here, I think there are things to suggest that the decision was not all that surprising. That being said, it wasn't a great decision. And it wasn't a great decision for a couple reasons. First of all, the court refused to state that DACA is itself a legal program. They could have come out and done that. And they chose not to. In fact, not only did they choose not to, but they said that the Attorney General at the time, who was Jeff Sessions, they said that he at the time said it was not a legal program and that they were willing to just defer to that. So not only did they not come out in favor of DACA, they essentially said whoever the Attorney General is can decide whether or not it's legal, and we won't even challenge that. So that's a little problematic. It would have been nice to see them come out in a little stronger defense of DACA. Another reason it wasn't a great decision is because the court said that the Department of Homeland Security only needed to consider the impact of DACA. So when they said that the decision was arbitrary because they didn't even look at the factors, they could have then taken it a step further, because there, as I understand during oral argument, there was some presentation of like economic data about the impact that DACA has had on the country. The court could have cited that data and come out and said, look, DACA is way too important to be taken away with the stroke of a pen. But they didn't. They said that the DHS only needed to consider the impact to DACA, but they said that they could still decide that deporting people who are here without status outweighs any economic benefit to the economy. And then the last thing that they did, and it was kind of in the same paragraph, is the court essentially provided a roadmap for the Department of Homeland Security to rescind DACA in the future. So they said not only was this rescission incorrect and they could have stopped there, they kind of gave a wink to the Department of Homeland Security and said, and if you want to go about rescinding DACA properly, here's how to do it. And then the very last sentence of the opinion is the court actually remanding the case back to the Department of Homeland Security for further reconsideration. So it seems to me like the court is kind of saying, look, you didn't get it right this time, but we're going to package it to you, put a nice little bow on it. Here's how you go about rescinding it properly in the future, and feel free to do it. So here's the actual language from that paragraph. And so what they said is the Department of Homeland Security could respond that reliance, right? So that's the failure to consider the impact to DACA, right? The reliance that people have on the benefits was unjustified in light of the original DACA memorandum, or the DHS might conclude that the reliance interests and benefits that it views as unlawful are entitled to no or diminished weight. Or the DHS could ultimately conclude that the reliance interests rank as as serious, but they are one factor to consider. And then finally, they said the DHS may determine in the particular context before it that other interests and policy concerns, such as deporting people, outweigh any reliance interests. So right here, the Supreme Court basically gave the DHS four different pathways to rescinding DACA. And what they said is, you got it wrong. Your decision was arbitrary and capricious for these two reasons. But if you provide any of these four reasons in this paragraph, it would probably be a proper rescission of DACA. So, you know, it's the kind of situation where, yes, the Supreme Court did rule against the administration, and they did vote to uphold DACA 5-4 for now. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. And so what is in store for the future of DACA? So the first point here is that it's unknown right now, all right? It's just too soon to know for sure whether or not the Department of Homeland Security is essentially going to accept the Supreme Court's invitation to rework the rescission. I think that they're probably going to. I mean, the president has already come out and said something, but if you're smart, you kind of just, you listen to the heads of the agencies, because they're the ones that figure out the day-to-day, and they're the ones that are going to ultimately implement a Supreme Court decision or not. So the decision of whether or not they're going to do so, I do think is largely political. And I think some of the factors will be the timing of the election, right? So we're about, what, 4 to 5 months away from the national election. I think poll numbers will be a factor as they continue to slide. I imagine that this administration is going to try to fight back and provide some red meat to its voters. And the bottom line right now, if there's one takeaway that you have from this entire presentation, it should be this: the fight for DACA is going to continue. The fight isn't over just because the Supreme Court decided that this one action in September of 2017 by the administration wasn't proper. DACA is still fighting for its life, and it needs us to support it. So moving forward, just as a general blanket statement, everybody who cares about these issues, and you should because you're a human being, should continue to fight this administration's anti-immigrant agenda. We need to advocate for a more permanent legislative solution. As I said from the very first slide, this was an executive action that President Obama took because the legislature failed to get comprehensive immigration reform done. And we need a solution that's going to help not just DACA recipients, but all other immigrant communities at risk of deportation. And, you know, one key way to do that is to support nonprofits and other organizations that are at the forefront of not just providing legal services to individuals on a case-by-case basis, but really fighting for reform and advocacy at a more institutional level to introduce remedies that are actually going to help people. So policy recommendations. So, you know, as an organization, we've been urging the governor to provide state funding for legal service providers to respond to what's ultimately going to be an increase in applications. I mean, at the very least in the short term, what the Supreme Court decision did was it took the pool of applicants who are eligible for DACA and it expanded them back to including initial applicants. And I think you're also going to get an increase, an influx of applications due to the advanced parole program. Another policy recommendation is to continue to provide pathways for DACA recipients to use their work and Social Security benefits, because impact arguments at the end of the day won this case. It was one of the two arguments that they looked at, was saying you need to consider the impact that this is going to have on people and their daily lives if you're going to try to take this program away. So what better way to try to come back and win the next round of this court fight, but to provide even more benefits to individuals that they're relying on to sort of increase the impact that the Department of Homeland Security is going to have to try to overcome by trying to take something like DACA away. And then individual recommendations, less on an institutional level, but more towards individuals. You know, continue the fight. Continue the fight with organizing, with protesting. You know, I don't think that it was a coincidence that also this decision came out in light of the fact that there are a lot of protests that have been happening and are continuing to happen throughout the country related to police brutality, and related to the unfair extrajudicial killing of Black individuals. And I'd like to think that a lot of these forces and a lot of the effort that people are putting into these movements are related. And at the end of the day, the court will respond to pressures that are exerted by social movements. What better way to do that than to keep the momentum going? For our part, CHIRLA, we do offer membership. It's $25 annually, but we also cover all DACA renewal fees for our members. So it kind of pays itself out very quickly. It's an investment that you make in CHIRLA because we are invested in communities throughout California. I'm not going to go through every one of these bullet points, but there are essentially professional and leadership skill and developments that we offer. We offer internships, volunteer opportunities, including not just with our organizations, but with sister organizations and campuses. And at the end of the day, we are an organization that has different component programs to what we do, but everything that we're trying to do is make the lives of our immigrants better. If you want any follow-up information or to contact us for any of our services, there are a couple of phone numbers on the screen. I will say, however, that we are servicing 4 CSUs and 11 community colleges right now, and you can contact the DRC or related department at any of those campuses to set up an appointment with us. So I think that's it in terms of the portion of the presentation portion of this. I hope that you were able to get some information about what the Supreme Court decision said and what it means for everyone moving forward. At this point, I'm going to stop the presentation and then defer back to Eric for the Q&A portion of today. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Andres. That information was insightful, detailed, well packaged. Thank you very much for that presentation. We will now move over to the Q&A portion. And so again, we are going to be using the Q&A feature. There is a little chat box that says Q&A. It's not the chat box, I shouldn't say that, it's the Q&A box. You can find that along the bottom of your Zoom screen. And so please do go ahead and type your questions in there, and I will facilitate the Q&A with Andres. And you do have the option of entering your questions anonymously if you would like. And we do have a couple of questions already, and so I'll start off with the first one. Would this have ended differently if deportation and benefits were argued separately? Or would capricious still apply on both counts?
Well, I think the arbitrary and capricious standard would have still won the day because there was a second reason that the court provided, and that was that you didn't even look at the impact that DACA would have. There was actually a note in the opinion by Justice Roberts that said, and we don't even have to consider the question of what would have happened if the Department of Homeland Security had separated the benefits from the deportation aspect of the program. So the Supreme Court itself decided to skirt around that question. That's a very insightful question, but I still think DACA would have been upheld as a program because they didn't even look at the impact that DACA would have to individuals. So even if they had only considered one component of the program but not the other, but they still weren't looking at the impact of DACA, I think the decision comes out the same.
Excellent, thank you. There's a question about the CHIRLA membership. They're saying, is the fee annual or monthly? And is this for individuals or organizations?
It's an individual fee and it's annual.
Excellent, thank you. There's also a couple of questions regarding new applicants. So they're wondering, when can new applications start going through? When can folks who have not had DACA start applying?
So, I mean, that's a great question. What the Supreme Court says is law. So right now, the DACA program, which includes initial applicants, is in effect in full. Now, how the Department of Homeland Security through USCIS is going to actually implement that remains to be seen. So we, as an organization, CHIRLA, we've actually already submitted both an advanced parole application and an initial application to see how they're going to be implemented by the Supreme Court. So I can't say for sure right now that you can certainly apply without the risk of immigration, denying or rejecting the application and eating your $495. But what I can say is right now, legally speaking, it is the law that initial applications must be accepted by USCIS. And so I guess I would encourage people to, check back in with us or make appointments with me on campus, because we should know in about 2 more weeks whether or not the applications that we've sent are accepted and will be processed.
Excellent, thank you. And Andres just mentioned seeing him on campus. I will just talk a little more about this near the end of the webinar, but we do have free legal services, free legal consultations available to Sac State students, staff, faculty, and your immediate family members. We partner with Chila, and Andres is the attorney that provides the services, and those are available through Zoom, and we are doing them throughout the summer as well. So I'll provide some more information a little later on how you can sign up for an immigration appointment. And then I'll also talk about, if you're not a Sac State student, staff, or faculty member, your campus may also have free legal services or referrals as well. There's a question: how can someone who's never had DACA and is now trying to apply prove that they have no felonies or a misdemeanor?
That's a great question. So it's always the burden of the applicant to show that they're eligible for something. For this one, USCIS does kind of help you out, because they do run background checks on everybody, and they will run your fingerprints to verify that you don't have a criminal history. So it's actually done after you apply. So once you apply, about a month or 2 later, you'll get an appointment from immigration just to go to one of their fingerprint locations. You do the fingerprints, and then they continue processing the application. And if they find something, they'll let you know, and they'll ask you to explain it. But if not, it's not an issue.
Thank you. Similarly related, what types of documents are needed for the application?
So for an initial application, you need to show a few things. You want to show your education here, whether that's a GED or a high school diploma, or even showing that you're currently enrolled in a high school or GED program. Aside from that, I think what the meat of this question is about the physical presence requirements. And so what we generally tell people to do is find one piece of evidence for every 3 months from here, dating back to June of 2007, showing that you were physically present in the US. So a lot of the most common things that I see are school records. So every year you have to re-enroll in school, you have to register, you have to submit like emergency contact paperwork. So showing that every school year, like August or September. Certainly any medical records, so any medical visits you've had, any vaccines, every time you go and get shots, there's like this little yellow pamphlet that they put your date in of receiving the shots. So if you can show that you were at Kaiser Sacramento, in June of 2010 getting shots, there's your physical evidence for that quarter. You can also show employment records. You have to be in the US to get a paycheck here, largely speaking. And then there are sort of secondary social media type things. If you have like a stamped entry of yourself visiting a location here in the US, that's a perfect piece of evidence for that time and date. This is kind of what the individual case level attorney works on with the client or with the student, to sort of kind of figure out, okay, because sometimes you do have to get a little bit creative and figure out what it is you can present to USCIS in order to meet that burden. And so I can give general pieces of advice here, but I think more on an individual level, once you're actually meeting with someone, then you might have some insights about, oh, well, you know, I had surgery in 2012. Okay, we can use that. Like, what else happened to you in your life? And then you can kind of tailor the evidence to the individual's life experiences here in the US.
Excellent, thank you. I do have a couple of other questions related to the type of proof and the documentation, which I think you hit on, or you addressed, you know, in the previous question. But so generally speaking, you're saying there's not one particular type of document they're going to require. It's more about proving that, you know, you were here in the United States, you know, during the times that are covered by DACA.
Exactly. And so, you know, the easiest thing is actually kind of pay stubs, right? Because they'll show like you worked 40 hours this week and 40 hours that week. And if you had all of that since 2007, that'd be great. But a lot of DACA applicants, especially ones that entered the US at a very young age, they were still kids back in 2007. And so a lot of people weren't working then. So there isn't one type of evidence. There's no one size fits all for this. I would say that when I do a DACA renewal application, and I'm doing several in a day, they all kind of blend. But initial applications are highly unique. They differ from person to person, and they can look drastically different depending on what the individual has done in the US and what evidence they have to show.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So then you're recommending that folks do seek legal services and legal advice to kind of understand exactly what kind of documentation they would submit.
Right. But then the other thing to keep in mind is that, you know, the people reviewing these applications are also human beings, right? And so they kind of will just look at something and whether it makes intuitive sense. So if you show a photograph of yourself, you know, at the Golden Gate Bridge and it doesn't have a timestamp, to the average person, that's not proof to them that you were anywhere on any specific date. But if you do have a timestamp, again, just keep in mind the officers viewing this, it's not like they have a rubric in front of them that says, you know, 50% of the types of evidence that is submitted has to be pay stubs and the other 25% has to be medical records and whatever. It varies. And so you're going to want to talk to somebody who has experience doing this to kind of figure out creatively what you're going to present in your case.
Thank you. There are a couple, we have some questions. I think maybe students asking if, you know, based on their case, they might qualify for DACA. Can you recap again the general like dates as far as when you would have had to be in the United States to qualify for DACA as it stands right now?
Sure. So I guess there's 3 or 4, depending on how you want to look at it, things, but you need to have been in the US since June 15th, 2007. And that's the big one. You've been here since June 2007 and you've never left the United States. The other one is that you were physically present in the United States on June 15th, 2012 when the DACA program came into effect. Now, I've always thought that was a little nonsensical because if you've been here since 2007, you also were here on some random date in 2012. So that's kind of one, maybe 2 requirements to look at it. The next one is that you came in to the US before you were 16. So if you came in when you were 15 and 360 days old, you're still good. If you came in the day after your 16th birthday, no good. And then the last one is that you were under the age of 31 as of June 15th, 2012. Another way to look at that is that you were born on June 16th, 1981 or later. So your birthday was June 16th, 1981 or after that.
Got it. Thank you. So then to reiterate, you know, we do, because we know that we have some students out there and at some of the high schools, for example, that don't have DACA because they missed out, right? And so some of these students may qualify now, but it's all going to depend on what you just said, like if they were here before 2008 and in 2012 when DACA went into effect, correct?
Right, and the most common thing that I hear is people who, so you also have to be at least 16 when you apply for DACA. 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds are not eligible for the program. So I know a lot of people who said, like, I was waiting for my 16th birthday to apply for DACA back in 2017 when they took the program away. So that's also a really common thing that I'm seeing, especially now if you're starting college. You were probably around that age. You were probably around 16 a few years ago. So if you missed the cutoff back then because of your age, that shouldn't be an issue now. And assuming you meet the other requirements, you should definitely get your case analyzed.
Thank you. So folks are asking where they can find the application to DACA.
Sure. So uscis.gov is a website. It's at uscis.gov. And you can download all immigration forms at uscis.gov. There are scammy sites like uscis.com or uscis.org. There are these places that try to use the USCIS emblem, and they'll charge you to print out the PDF and send you the applications. So keep in mind, even though actually sending the application costs money, it never, ever, ever costs money to download the application. Or USCIS has even offered, if you call their 800 number, they'll actually mail the forms out to you individually. I never recommend doing this for a couple reasons. One, you don't want to give USCIS your address unless you're proactively asking for something in return, like a DACA application. But then second, it's a lot quicker to download the form online. It's a PDF, and you'll know, and it's actually really nice. Every form that's on the USCIS.gov website has a PDF of the actual form and then a PDF of instructions. So if you are kind of going through something, or you're helping someone go through it, and you're not understanding something, you can try to consult the instructions. The instructions, they'll have details on where to mail applications, how much the fee is, who to make the check or money order out to. It's a very helpful tool. So again, the website is uscis.gov. That's where all the applications are. And for this one, you're going to want the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals one.
Excellent. Along the same lines, do you recommend that folks apply on their own? What's that process like, especially for new applicants, or do you recommend that they seek out legal services?
Well, I think the biggest danger with a self-mailed application is any errors that pop up might be grounds for immigration to deny your application. And in most of those cases, they're going to keep your money. So I've heard of private sector attorneys who are money grubbers and will charge up to like $1,000 for a DACA renewal. I certainly wouldn't go to an attorney who's charging any sort of outlandish price. I would try to seek a nonprofit, because a lot of the nonprofit provide legal services free of charge. And so I don't know that I would necessarily recommend going to a private attorney for a DACA, but I would certainly recommend seeking actual legal help, because the last thing you want is to have like one missed checked box to be the difference between you getting your DACA on time versus having to reapply, pay the fee again, and then wait another few months.
Excellent, thank you. Let's see. So a follow-up question to that, what would be a reasonable amount to pay an attorney for a DACA application renewal?
$0 if you have access to it. I mean, anything above $0 is worse than somebody who will, find somebody who's trained. So find a reputable organization. Before you meet with an attorney of any organization, look them up. Every nonprofit has to have a website. There's all sorts of 501c3 requirements. So I would definitely do a little bit of research, do your homework, and try to find somebody who's willing to provide the service without having to rely on paying somebody, a private attorney, for it. And the other thing I will say is that I spent 6 years in private practice before I joined a nonprofit. And I know as well as anybody that private attorneys have discovered ways to manipulate their social media reviews. So just because somebody has 4.9 stars on Google and 4.8 on Yelp doesn't necessarily mean that, that they're a good attorney or that they're providing a valuable service. All it means is that they have their SEO game down and that they're probably hiring somebody to manipulate their social media review and their social media presence.
Thank you, Andres. I just want to piggyback on what Andres just talked about, the free services, right? So if you are a student at one of the CSUs, one of the 23 CSUs, there are free legal services on your campus. Many of the community colleges also offer this service, not all, but do connect with the Dreamer Resource Center or Undocu Resource Center that exists on your particular campus. And they may have a resource or an organization that they can refer you to. At the end of this webinar, I will also be sharing a link to a resource folder that contains some resources and websites that you can access to look up free legal services in your area as well. So like Andres is saying, do your homework. We do know that at this time, right, there's a lot of predatory individuals out there who may be, advertising services or advertising, guarantees that they cannot actually, come or follow through with. And so it's important that rather than just jumping on, going to any attorney and paying $200 for a consultation, that you do your research and do your homework and you find an organization that might have those services. Particularly in Northern California, there are several. And then I'm also seeing that if you're a UC student, all 10 UC campuses also provide free legal services for students and immediate family members as well. Thank you. There are some questions. So if your application is denied, are you putting yourself at risk for possible future issues such as deportation?
Yes and no. So what I would say is that on paper, yes, but in practice, it doesn't quite shake out that way. So there was a memo that this administration issued in June of 2018. And what it says is that if you apply for something with USCIS and you are denied and you don't have any other sort of protection to fall back on, then you are subject to removal proceedings. Now, which is deportation proceedings. That's where essentially they will put you in front of a deportation judge. And if you can't prove that you have some pathway to a visa or a green card or citizenship, then you'll get deported. Now, I say that that's how it works on paper, but that's not necessarily how it works out in practice. And the main reason is it's largely an issue of convenience. I mean, there are 11 million or more undocumented individuals, and the court system has the capacity to deport like in the thousands every year. And so there is a system in place right now for figuring out who is a priority for deportation and who is not. Having a rejected DACA application by USCIS does not put you on that priority for deportation list. So what I would say is that if you apply for something and it's denied, technically you are put into a pool of people who are subject to removal proceedings, but that pool is so large and it's largely focused on other individuals right now that I don't think you should be afraid that ICE is going to show up at your house the next day and say, oh, here, your application was denied, please come with us.
Thank you. Kind of along the same lines, and you may have hit it, when DACA first started, we had close to 800,000 applicants. Now we have between 500 and 600,000. Is there any protection they can't use this information against us?
So this has been another issue that's been really contested because the administration came out and said that the information in any application was fair game for removal operations, which is the fancy word that ICE uses for going out and rounding people up. There was a lot of pushback that the administration received when they announced that, even including from some members of Congress in his own party. As of right now, I can't say that legally there's anything binding on one side or the other saying, no, this information can't be used. I do remember a high profile case, I want to say sometime in maybe 2016 or 2017, of an individual whose DACA application was used to initiate the deportation process. But those cases are very few and far between. And I imagine that it would be disastrous for the administration politically to engage in that kind of behavior. And when you think about this president and this administration, I mean, whether it's good for him or bad for him politically is pretty much the only calculus in his decision making. So I think that while there isn't something that's legally binding, I think that there is a very remote chance that a DACA application would be used against an individual. And then obviously if you're in current DACA status, it can't be used against you.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. We have a question. If I've been working under the table, not legally, should I still use pay stubs to verify my presence in the US?
Yeah, I mean, USCIS recognizes that a lot of people are working with different socials, invented, social security. In Spanish, we call them chuecos. So that's a very common occurrence. Now, I will say this. It is a very serious immigration offense for USCIS to falsely claim US citizenship in order to work. So if your employer said, just give me a social, I just need a social to write one down, and you pulled something out of a hat, that's fine. If you recall very specifically on your I-9 paperwork at a job, when you started up there, checking the box that says, yes, I am a US citizen, then I would probably consult with an attorney before providing USCIS anything related to that.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions regarding advanced parole. I suspect maybe some folks joined us a little later. Can you just quickly tell us what's happening with advanced parole again, if you don't mind? Sure.
So advanced parole is kind of in the same boat that initial DACA applications are right now, where it is the law. Legally speaking, the Supreme Court has decided that this program remains in place. And we're just kind of waiting to see how USCIS will implement that. The way advanced parole worked prior to the rescission in September of 2017 was if you qualify for one of three reasons: humanitarian, work, or education, and you can demonstrate a valid reason to travel under one of those three umbrellas of the program, then you can qualify for a permit, a one-time exit and re-entry, and there shouldn't be any issue with the re-entry because it's an advanced parole. And I will say that even the current executive order that was signed this past week by the president about limiting immigration into the US, right, closing the border, it makes an exception for people that already have advanced parole documents in hand. And so that's kind of why I said the coronavirus and political issues might limit the approval of those applications moving forward. But once it's approved, it's the whole point of the program is that you're getting permission in advance. It's an advanced parole, which allows you to leave the US to engage in one of the three activities and then come back. Generally speaking, trips are about 3 weeks, 4 weeks, maybe 6 weeks. I wouldn't try to do anything any longer than that. And we have yet to see right now how USCIS is going to implement that. As an organization, CHIRLA has already submitted an application, so we kind of want to see how it's going to play out. And certainly we'll be able to provide more information on that later.
Excellent, thank you. Do you know, are there any other nonprofit organizations that you would recommend folks contact regarding potential legal services, free legal services?
I mean, it all kind of depends on what county you're in. There are a few organizations such as Chirla or Catholic Charities that have presence pretty much throughout the entire state. I would say, you know, in every major populous county, certainly. You know, those are kind of the two big ones that come to mind. We have sister organizations that we have a partnership with as well. You know, Carecen does good work, the Asian Alliance. It's kind of tough to get into that without knowing, like, kind of on a county by county basis where the asker is from, but there's certainly organizations that operate throughout the state. And I would encourage you to just do a little bit of research, figure out what the organization's mission statement is, figure out their employees, see the attorneys there. Since, you know, at the end of the day, you're working with an organization, but you're working with an individual attorney on a specific case. So, you know, feel free to use those tools to kind of figure out what an organization is about before, you can certainly take the appointment with them, but I would certainly recommend doing a little bit of homework before agreeing to sign anything.
Okay, thank you. There's a follow-up question to the advanced parole question. Does re-entry affect those who have been in the immigration system but have not been deported?
It depends. So I will say that advanced parole, when you leave the United States and come back with that travel document, it is considered a lawful entry. And so for a lot of people in the DACA program, the most recent entry that they have to the United States is an unlawful one. And having a lawful entry as your most recent one can certainly open up certain avenues for you, such as a green card, depending on your family status and who your family members are. So for somebody who's already been in the system, so I wonder if this is the question then. So somebody with a deportation order already on their record, if that person leaves the US, generally speaking, they have executed that deportation order and they have self-deported. However, if you travel outside the US and return on an advanced parole document, even if you are subject to a final deportation order, it doesn't count as a deportation. So I don't know if that was the question or if it was more about the green card situation, but the fact is leaving on an advanced parole document and coming back can open up certain avenues for you. And if you have a deportation order, it doesn't count as a deportation.
Okay, excellent, thank you. And if the person who asked that, if that's not what they were getting at, feel free to type into the chat again. Let's see. There's a question from an educator. For campuses that have different legal groups that provide services to our students, are there particular things we should do to make sure that different organizations don't give different advice? For example, each organization may have different philosophies regarding the risk related to new DACA applications or advanced parole.
Well, I mean, I think the simplest way to, I don't know if this question is getting at, trying to get the organizations to come into agreement, because the organizations are different entities. They're going to have different calculuses for determining something. I think one way to at least understand what everyone's points of view are, you can certainly hold events such as this one, or invite like a panel of speakers from the different organizations. I know, for example, Sac State has the I Stand With Immigrants Day annually in October. An event like that would be a good forum to bring the different, representatives from the different organizations to the table and sort of kind of understand what their viewpoints are and kind of have these questions more out in the open. The only other thing that I will say to that, though, the caveat, I guess, is that it's always the client's choice. So in private practice, I would sit people down all the time and I would say, here are all the risks and the benefits. Here are the pros and cons of the possible decisions in front of you. And they would always ask me, what would you do? And I can't answer that. As an attorney, we're allowed to assess risk. We're allowed to explain legal consequences. but I can't tell an individual any more than someone from a different organization can tell an individual, yes, apply, or no, don't apply. And to the extent that there are service providers that give different opinions on issue X, maybe have an individual set up different consultations and get a second or a third legal opinion, and then leave it up to the individual to decide what risks he or she wants to take.
Excellent, thank you. I'm seeing a couple of more questions regarding nonprofit organizations that might be able to help with the renewal, and also a couple of questions regarding funding. I am going to put into the chat box a couple of websites that I recommend that those of you that are interested access. One of them is from Informed Immigrant, and they've kind of compiled a tool where you can look up immigration services free, typically free. You'll have to contact that organization to find out specifically. But that is a helpful tool that we've used to help folks find legal services. There's also the Immigration Services website from the Department of Social Services. That's also a very helpful tool for finding organizations perhaps in your area or in your county that are offering free legal services or legal services at a reduced cost. For those of you asking about funding for DACA renewals, Andres, can you talk a little bit about that, maybe from the CHILA perspective, and then I can add a little bit based on what I've heard from other organizations as well?
Sure. Well, from our perspective, I would say 85% of the time we have funding available to cover not just the immigration services. I mean, we prepare and mail out applications free of charge, but the actual immigration fees. So as of June 16th, we were not expecting the Supreme Court decision to go the way that it went. And so right now we're in a position where we're seeking more funding to be able to cover that $495 fee. And what I tell individuals during the consultation is to feel free to sign up with our services, and that if funding becomes available in the course of the application, we'd be more than happy to provide it. We generally do it on a first come, first served basis. But up until now, I mean, from about February till June 16th, we were providing that $495 application fee for individuals.
Excellent, thank you. I will also add that at the Dreamer Resource Center at Sac State, we also work with a few different organizations, and we stay in constant contact. And at this time, we are not aware of any organization that still has funding to cover the fees. That does not mean that there may not be funding that comes through in the future, but there were a couple of questions regarding that. And so right now, again, you may be able to find free legal services to help you with the application process, but finding an organization that is covering the $495 fee may take a little bit because funding has been exhausted at this time for most organizations that we're familiar with. Let's see. There's, if someone has pled guilty to a DUI or other misdemeanor, other options for staying in the U.S.?
Well, staying in the U.S. is a separate question from the DACA program. So the DACA program itself has a requirement that you do not have a DUI on your record, so it would foreclose that possibility. But as I mentioned earlier, I alluded to this, and it was actually going to be a central part of my presentation if the DACA decision had gone the other way. DACA is just a sub-program of deferred action generally. And deferred action could be asked for from immigration at any time and for any reason. Now, it doesn't mean they'll grant it. They actually tend to be pretty restrictive with who gets deferred action or who doesn't. Generally speaking, there are two kinds of groups of people that get deferred action grants approved at a higher rate than others. So one is somebody with a U.S. military service person. So if the argument is that, please grant me deferred action, don't deport me, allow me to stay here in the U.S. because I have a family member who's in the military and, they won't be able to serve the nation properly if they're worried about me. That is one group of individual that does tend to get deferred action grants approved at a higher rate. And then the other one is somebody with a sick U.S. citizen relative. So, don't, I have a child. My child is 2 years old and is gravely ill, is in need of constant therapies and treatments. If you deport me, this person is going to suffer a lot. So please grant me deferred action and just postpone my any deportation action against me, postpone it for a year or 2 years, and then renew as necessary. But so that is one option that is available to individuals, is you don't have to do the childhood arrivals sub-program of deferred action, but you can just apply for general deferred action.
Thank you. After renewing your DACA application, how long does it take to receive your card?
Depends on how lucky you are. So, I mean, we've had individuals get their renewal cards back in 3 weeks or even a month. And I've seen people that have waited 9 months. There are, I would say, red flags in cases that have given me reason to suspect that that's the reason that they're taking longer. So anybody with an arrest, even if it wasn't one of the, felony or significant misdemeanor, even if it was just an arrest that didn't even lead to a conviction, those are usually cases where processing might take a little bit longer. Funny stuff always happens with bureaucracy. So, I've had individuals where their cases are, it just seems like it was just sitting on someone's desk for a month or two longer than other individuals. There is a USCIS case processing times website that you can just Google and find. And once you're on the website, you can type in the form type. So if this is a DACA, it's an I-821D. And you can put in the service location, which will be at the bottom of any notice you get from immigration. So it'll say like the California Service Center or the Texas Service Center. So you just type in the form number, type in the office, the center where your application is being processed, and then it'll give you a window. It'll say, 6 to 8 months. And so generally speaking, if you're still in that time frame, you just have to wait. But if you're outside of that time frame, right, like it says applications are taking 6 to 8 months, but you've been waiting 9 months, then you can actually call an 800 number with USCIS and kind of grease the wheels and figure out what's going on with your case. So, it depends on the office that's processing your application. It's something that you can always look up, but then always keep in mind, like it's a real crapshoot. I mean, it can take a very short amount of time. It can take a long amount of time, and sometimes there's no rhyme or reason.
Thank you. So it looks like we're getting down to just the final last few questions. Considering the risk involved with re-entering the U.S., varied discretion at points of entry on advanced parole. So considering the risk involved with re-entering the U.S. on advanced parole, is CHIDLA taking a stance on advising applicants that advanced parole is a viable option to take at this point?
So we kind of want to figure out where USCIS is with this, because if they're going to take the stance that they took back in 2016 and 17 when they were still doing these applications, we'd be more than happy to advocate that people start using this as a tool and even submitting the applications ourselves. That being said, we're still waiting. We've kind of been proactive, so we're not just waiting to see like an announcement or a press conference that USCIS has to announce what they're going to do. We've actually submitted an application, and so we as an organization, we are trying to figure out, the DACA decision is so new that we need to figure out what USCIS is going to make this look like in practice before we can take an official stance. But I will say that it is the law. The Supreme Court has said the rescission is no good. The program is back in full in its original, on its original terms as established in 2012. And so the law right now is that, yes, you should be given advanced parole. And the other thing I will say to that is that there's less of a risk with traveling once you already have advanced parole. I think now what we're going to see is the bottleneck at the application stage, and we might see more denials than we're used to seeing. But certainly once you have an advanced parole document, you can't legally be held outside the US. I have heard of it happening, so I won't say, the government doesn't always follow its own laws. But before we can take an official stance on what the risk is or whether somebody should do it, we kind of want to see how it's going to play out. And you should always make a consultation, because a question like that it's very highly specific to the individual case. It's hard to say, yes, all advanced parole applications should go forward, or no, none of them should.
Excellent, thank you. Would a ticket like running a stop sign infect an application?
Generally speaking, no. I would make sure that it's paid off, because at the end of the day, there is that good moral character requirement for the DACA program, and really a lot of different immigration benefits. So, you're not a bad person. This is immigration stance. You're not a bad person because you ran a red light or, failed to stop at a stop sign, but you are if you're, delinquent in payments and you're trying to run from the law now. So I would certainly advise making sure that any and everything is paid off before applying for DACA, but it's not something that will really affect an application.
Excellent, thank you. Did we understand correctly in you saying that in about 2 to 3 weeks, we may know more about what DHS or USCIS is going to do about new DACA applications?
That's our hope. And so, you can always just sit around and wait for them to make an announcement, which we're certainly going to be, aware of when that happens. But we also do have a case that went out, and so we're going to hope to see what happens with it. Hopefully it won't be a case that's just held in abeyance. That's where USCIS receives an application. It's very common in these contexts. They receive an application, but they hold off on making any decisions on it until they receive word from like the head of DHS or the Attorney General or whoever it is. In this case, it would be the head of DHS. So that is another possibility, but we're hoping that in another couple of weeks, we'll be able to have a test case that lets us know what direction this is moving in.
Wonderful, thank you. So I do just see one last question in the chat box, or excuse me, in the Q&A box. I do invite those of you that do have a question left to please go ahead and type it in now. So I will answer or go with this question, and then we'll see if any others come in. So they're saying, thank you for your very informative presentation. Given the Supreme Court's decision, how is Chile prioritizing its advocacy efforts?
Well, it's our advocacy right now is kind of contingent on a couple things. As we mentioned, we have a couple different case types that we're waiting on. And so right now our advocacy efforts are not really geared one way or the other towards people should definitely apply or people should definitely withhold from applying. One danger, and again, this is the main situation that we want to avoid, is individuals losing their fee because they submit an application and then immigration denies, saying that they don't have enough guidance yet. So again, we're not really advocating one way or another. But, in terms of our own cases, we certainly have members that we're aware of that are candidates for initial applications or advanced parole. And we're going to prioritize individuals that we already know of to make those applications if and when we know that they're free to do so. But right now our advocacy is largely in hold. There's a lot of different aspects that will go into our decision calculus, and we're still waiting on things before we as an organization will advocate one way or the other.
Excellent, thank you. Doesn't look like there are any other questions in the Q&A box. So again, if you do have one last question, please go ahead and pop that in. Otherwise, we will start to wrap things up. So first, I want to thank Andres for joining us today. Andres, you and Chigla have been wonderful partners throughout the last year. We appreciate your insight, your commitment to supporting undocumented individuals, and to providing accurate and reliable information to our immigrant communities. Thanks again. That was a great presentation, and we really appreciate all of the questions you answered. Thank you.
Of course, it's always been a pleasant experience working with you guys too.
Thank you.
And I want to thank also everybody who joined today. You know, I had a feeling, I had a premonition that maybe no one would show up, that, you know, the Supreme Court decides against DACA, everyone needs information, but when they favor it, then, you know, nobody really shows up. But we had over 100 people today. So, and, you know, that's largely thanks to your efforts, but then also thank you everybody for taking time out of your Friday afternoon to hear this and to just kind of be aware of what's going on and educating yourselves.
Yeah, thank you. Great turnout. We were very pleased. Thank you. I also want to thank the Northern California and DocuCenters Collaborative, and in particular, Joanne Ramirez, Outreach Specialist and Dream Center Liaison at Cosumnes River College. Thank you for your partnership and for being great collaborators. Together, we will continue to empower students in the Sacramento region and throughout Northern California. Before I end, I want to share a few resources and additional information. I want to remind Sac State folks that the Dreamer Resource Center offers free immigration legal consultations in partnership with Chigla. These are open to Sac State students, faculty, staff, and immediate family members. Our appointments are available Fridays from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. via Zoom, and they are happening during the summer as well, so please contact us. Andres is actually our assigned attorney, so he's the one that provides those services. And if you do want to make an appointment and you are, again, a Sacramento State student, faculty member, or staff member, you just need to contact us by emailing drc@csus.edu or calling 916-278-7734 to make an appointment. For students who are not from Sacramento State, please remember that some of your campuses also offer free legal services or referrals. I recommend that you contact your Dream Center or a DocuResource program for assistance. Additionally, there are, like we said, other organizations in Sacramento and surrounding areas that offer free legal services. The Fuel Network, Sacramento Fuel Network, has a network of organizations that they work with, including, for example, the Sacramento Food Bank and Family Services. As part of today's briefing, we created a resource folder that contains a list of legal service providers in the area, a DACA toolkit, and other pertinent resources. This folder is public, and you can access it by visiting tinyurl.com/DACA resources. I'm going to put that in the chat box now. And again, that is a link to a public folder that has various resources that will help you, find an organization to renew your DACA or to inquire about other legal questions you may have. There's also other toolkits and things that we think you may find helpful. I again want to thank all of you for joining today's briefing. Thank you for taking the time this afternoon, on Friday afternoon, to come and learn more and know how you can prepare yourself to either apply for DACA or continue to be an advocate for students that have DACA. While the Supreme Court's decision was a much needed sigh of relief, like Andres explains, this is not over. Ultimately, we know that DACA is part of a larger broken immigration system that directly impacts the students in the communities we serve. Therefore, we must remain hopeful and come together to continue empowering students that are impacted by undocumented status. To educators, allies, and advocates that joined today, thank you for your dedication and commitment. To our students, we stand with you. We will continue to advocate for your rights. Your home is here. Take care, everyone. Thank you for joining. Be well.